Stanny. I'm going to talk about, there are essentially 4 subcommittees that met on their own in addition to the full OSTWIG group, and I'm going to talk about 2 of them, education and parental controls, technology. Mike's going to talk about the other 2, child pornography and data retention. Before I get into those, I wanted to just relay a little story that inspired me to actually say something interesting today. And it happened to be while I was sitting in traffic. Yes, you will be the judge of that ultimately. It happened to be while I was sitting in traffic, and as it happened to be, I was listening to a radio show about traffic, and they were interviewing one particular person who commutes every day from Fredericksburg, Virginia, to Wisconsin Ave here in the district. As you know, that's at least a 50-mile drive, and he said on bad days it takes him 3 hours to do that commute. And I was thinking, okay, my 20 minutes isn't quite so bad then, despite what I was doing sitting in traffic. But then they had an interview from a regional traffic engineer, and he was talking about how, well, you know, DC is there's a lot of people actually don't know the best routes here in DC because it's such a transient city. People move in and out, and that part of their job right now is to actually educate people on what the alternatives are for public transportation and even for driving routes. And so sitting there, I was like, you know what? Maybe DC traffic is a lot like navigating the internet in some ways. You know, there's a lot of different options. People get easily overwhelmed. Sometimes it can be slow, but ultimately, what's the key here? And that's education. But if you call the internet transient, what would you call, or if you called DC transient, what would you call the internet? Well, if you looked, what we called it is actually a living internet. That's our report to NTIA, Youth Safety on a Living Internet. And that's really the dilemma for parents and for educators and for law enforcement and policymakers. The internet is living. And much like in everyday life, we operate without true understanding of the risks. So what the subcommittee, and actually every subcommittee was trying to do is really to get, you know, separate fact from fiction, determine what the risks are for children online, and then report back. And what we found with education was that there are 2 things that we hear a lot about, but actually aren't quite as high probability of risk to a child as you'd think. The first one is predation on the internet. Studies have shown that the probability of a young person being physically assaulted from an adult that they first met online is actually quite low. And instead, rather, it's risky behavior online, kids talking about sex to people online that they may or may not even know, but it's usually an adult, and kids are somehow engaging in this behavior willingly, which is kind of the wrong thing, but they do. And really, when kids are solicited about sex, it's not from adults. It's actually from their peers. And we can get into the peer-to-peer issue a little bit later, because there are some issues involved with that. The second issue that you hear a lot about, but is actually not as common as you'd think, is sexting. This is when kids send nude photos via text on their cell phones to other kids. And it's not as widespread as you think. I guess maybe 4% of kids have actually participated in this. You hear it, of course, on the news, and it can actually be very traumatizing and damaging to people who've had their photos shared. But it's not something that we've found, at least as a study group, that was a big problem. What was the biggest problem? Cyberbullying and cyber harassment. And this is the generally peer-on-peer issue. And this is something that is the most frequent threat that minors face online. And it's something that, given that risk, drove us to make certain recommendations on how we can move forward with policy. So the Education Subcommittee came up with 4 recommendations. The first one was one that works, I think, no matter what the committee, but was avoid scare tactics. Instead, we want to promote social norms and good etiquette on the internet. The second one was to promote digital citizenship, media literacy, and computer security in pre-K through 12 education. And this should be a national priority. There are some states that have required that this be mandated into the curriculum, and however, this is something that the task force actually felt like should be a national priority. Third is we should be focusing online safety programs on risk prevention, including intervention with high-risk youth. We heard from one person who actually was a risk prevention expert. She talked about different risks that kids face, and there are ways to intervene with the high-risk kids, and that's essentially the same kids who are high risk offline are the same kind of kids who are high risk online. And finally, and this is an ambitious one that we'll see if it moves forward, but there should be a digital literacy core for schools and communities nationwide, much like we have with AmeriCorps or Teach for America.